Hey guys, tonight we're not sipping cocoa by a fireplace or scrolling through monk memes. No, tonight you're crouched inside a smoke-choked Viking longhouse, squinting through the haze while someone roasts elk on an open hearth. The walls sweat with soot. The air is thick with pine pitch and wet dog, and someone's just tossed a carved antler into the fire as an offering to Thor. It smells like smoke, sweat, and slightly singed belief. You're not a Christian yet. No one here is. The only thing holy in this room is your uncle's beard, which has trapped at least 3 food groups, and possibly a small god. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your local time and location in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You live in a time when the world is both terrifying and comfortingly simple. There are gods in the sky, spirits in the forest, and nobody judges you for screaming at a thunderstorm. You burn offerings, mumble charms over fishnets, and wear a little hammer around your neck. Not because it's trendy, but because it's Thor's. And frankly, you don't want your boat capsizing. Religion, if you even call it that, is not about salvation. It's about survival. The gods aren't there to forgive you. They're there to watch you, challenge you, maybe curse you, and if you're lucky, grant you just enough favor to raid the next village and not die horribly. Morality is a flexible thing, tied to honor and vengeance more than commandments. If someone insults your honor, you don't pray for them. You challenge them to holmgang, fight with axes, and maybe take their goats. But even here, in this remote longhouse lit by seal-fat lamps and ambition, something is stirring. Whispers of new gods have already begun drifting up the fjords. Traders bring strange tales of a god who died, of men who wear long robes and talk about turning cheeks instead of turning tables. You laugh. Of course. A god who lets himself get killed? Absurd. What kind of deity loses on purpose? Still, the world is changing. Your cousin returned from Francia with silver trinkets covered in little crosses. He says they ward off evil. They also buy you a lot of mead. You're not sure which is more important. At your feast tonight, someone sings of Odin and the World Tree, of Loki's tricks and Freya's beauty, but then someone else quietly mentions a man nailed to wood, crowned with thorns, bleeding not from battle, but from betrayal. You roll your eyes, sip your ale, and file it away. Curiosity isn't sinful yet. Mainstream historical accounts agree that Norse paganism, rich in ritual, mythology, and localized worship, was the dominant belief system during the early Viking Age, circa 800 CE. It wasn't centralized, no Viking pope, no temple hierarchy, just a patchwork of beliefs held together with goat blood and shared fear of frost giants. Rituals were communal, often bloody, and usually practical. Sacrifices for harvest, blessings for voyages, the occasional human if things got really bad. And yet, change begins not with trumpets, but with whispers. You hear of a Viking chieftain down the coast who lets a Christian monk stay in his hall. Not as a slave, but as a guest. Weird flex, but okay. The monk doesn't eat meat on Fridays, talks to himself in Latin, and builds a tiny chapel out of driftwood. No one's burned him yet. Curious. Historians still argue whether early Viking exposure to Christianity was primarily economic, political, or spiritual. Was it the shiny silver relics that caught their eye? The literacy? The exotic rituals? Or the fact that Christian kings, with their written laws and tax systems, seemed weirdly successful? There's also the fringe theory that some Norse traders adopted Christian tokens, not for belief but as travel insurance. A little cross tucked under your tunic made foreign ports more welcoming. Gods as accessories, very on brand. Tonight, though, none of that matters. You're sharpening a blade while your sister weaves runes into a cloak. There's a thunderstorm outside. You nod toward the sky and mutter a blessing to Thor, just in case. Your faith isn't formal. It doesn't need cathedrals. It needs wind, fire, and the promise that if you die in battle, Valkyries will come for you. You can't imagine that changing. But tomorrow, a ship will arrive from the south. A quiet man in robes will step off with a book, a cross, and a very bad haircut. He'll ask for shelter. He won't flinch when someone points a spear at him. And slowly, without anyone noticing, your gods will start to make room for his. The fire pops. Someone throws more antler onto the coals. You smell it burn, bone and memory. Faith, after all, is a slow-burning thing. You're already awake when the shouting starts. Too many winters in this village have trained your ears to snap open before your eyes. Boots hit wet ground. Someone's yelling about sails on the horizon, but it's not a raid this time. The longship glides in like any other, but the men on it aren't your kind. Robes, tongers, not a single axe in sight. You lean against the doorpost and squint at the shoreline. These men don't carry shields. They carry books. What follows next becomes legend. The year is 793, and the place is Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the northeast coast of England. You wouldn't know the name, but you'd know the hall. Gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, manuscripts written by candlelight over decades, all scooped up in a single day by men who don't ask permission. They look like you. That's the uncomfortable part. Your people, Norsemen, Danes, call yourselves what you want. Rode across the North Sea and hit Lindisfarne like a lightning strike. Historians call this the beginning of the Viking Age, but for you, it's just a good day's work. The monastery, they say, had no walls, no real defenses, just prayer, silence, and soft monks with soft hands. You don't have time for that. You barge in. They're chanting, confused. Some don't even run. You take what you want. Silver plates, ceremonial swords, even the pages of some sacred book with strange drawings of a man on a cross. You're not sure why you take it, but you do. Later, someone tears a corner out to patch a boot. To be clear, you're not attacking Christianity. You're attacking wealth. You've probably never heard the word Christianity said aloud, but the monks, frail, pale, and oddly calm, don't scream about Thor or fight back like warriors. They kneel. Some cry. One raises his hand in a cross shape and whispers something that sounds like a spell, but the raiders don't care. It's just another plunder, just another day. But that day echoes louder than the storm. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it an immense slaughter, noting omens in the sky and dire prophecies. For you, it's more practical. The monks didn't fight back, and they had great stuff, which means more monasteries get marked on the map. This is where the irony kicks in. Christianity, this unfamiliar and peaceful faith, doesn't repel the Vikings. It attracts them, because it's rich, organized, and, bafflingly, it writes things down. The monks may die or be taken, but the books they leave behind survive. They call it the Word of God. You call it something we can sell. But even then, a few among you don't sell. They flip the pages, stare, ask questions. That's when it starts. Not belief, yet, but curiosity. You've grown up around carved stones, spoken sagas, oral memory. But these books, they hold stories in silence. You don't understand Latin, but someone tells you this one talks about a man who walks on water. This one says your gods aren't real. This one insists there's only one God, and he loves you. You snort and toss it in a crate with some candlesticks. Still, the idea of one God is strange, dangerous, even. It simplifies the chaos. You're used to juggling a dozen deities for different needs: fertility, war, crops, fish, one-size-fits-all deity, risky, but also kind of efficient. Fringe scholars still debate how much of Viking hostility to Christianity was religious and how much was strategic. Did they hate the cross, or just the people behind it? Evidence suggests most early raids targeted rich, undefended monasteries, not churches inside fortified towns. You weren't picking theological fights. You were picking low-hanging fruit. You've heard of Iona, too, another monastic site. Same fate, same outcome. More books, more trinkets, more stories. But eventually, someone on one of these raids does something different. He keeps a monk, brings him home. And now, your village has a man in brown robes who doesn't speak Norse, won't eat meat on certain days, and carves little crosses into wood scraps while murmuring into the wind. Kids throw stones at him at first. You just watch. Then one day, he bandages your cousin's wound after a boar hunt. Prays over it. The wound doesn't fester. You're not saying it's magic. You're just saying, that was oddly fast healing. And so, the monk stays. He sets up a small shrine, builds a tiny cross, teaches someone how to write their name, starts learning Norse himself, tells stories, strange ones, of miracles and saints, of fire from heaven and demons and pigs. Most of your village ignores him. Some laugh. A few listen. And you, well, you still sharpen your axe in the evenings, but now you glance at that carved wooden cross on the monk's doorway just a little longer than you used to, just in case. You've seen plenty of loot in your life, bits of amber, arm rings, foreign silks, even a petrified monkey's paw someone swore brought good luck. It didn't, but lately, something keeps showing up in the spoils. Tiny silver crosses, not always valuable in weight, but persistent. They dangle from chains, peek out from priestly robes, or rest quietly in reliquaries that smell like old incense and cracked hope. At first, you melt them down. Silver is silver, right? But then someone starts wearing one. Not you, of course. Your cousin. The one who talks too much and drinks too little. He says it makes merchants trust him. You call it cheating. He calls it diplomacy. Still, the little cross catches on. Not as a symbol of faith, at least not yet, but as a kind of charm. Something new. Something exotic. It's not a hammer of Thor, but it fits neatly around your neck and doesn't clash too much with your wolf pelt cloak. Someone jokes that it might keep away Christian curses. You're not sure whether they're being serious. Across the fjords, this starts happening more and more. Raiders bring back relics not to defile, but to collect. One man keeps a saint's fingerbone in a pouch around his neck. not out of reverence, but because he swears it stopped a storm. Someone else uses a stolen psalter to prop up a table leg. You still don't get it. This Christ God, he doesn't look like a fighter. No ravens, no wolves, no war songs. Just a thin, bleeding figure nailed to wood, staring mournfully into the void like someone waiting for a bad haircut to end. You joke that if Odin ever saw him, he'd give him a spear and tell him to toughen up. But even you start to notice something odd. Your dreams. They've changed. Less storm and sword, more light and whisper. One night, you dream of a cloaked figure touching your forehead. You wake up sweating and annoyed. You go out to the woods to offer a sacrifice to Odin, just to be safe, but it feels off. The usual thrill is missing. The silver cross your cousin wears catches the moonlight. You roll your eyes and mutter that he's been cursed with politeness. Mainstream historians confirm that many Norse artifacts from this transitional period contain a blend of pagan and Christian symbols. Thor's hammer worn side by side with crosses, burial sites including both grave goods and Christian tokens. This overlap isn't accidental, it's survival. You're not choosing sides yet. You're hedging bets. You hear that King Harald in Norway converted to Christianity, but kept his sacrificial feasts, just in case. Someone jokes he now prays before battle and makes offerings after. That's what scholars later call dual belief. But for you, it's just smart insurance. There's also a strange shift in the way relics are treated. In the past, you'd toss a gold-plated book aside in favor of an arm ring. Now, some warriors set aside pieces of Christian art, not to sell, but to keep. There's something unsettlingly powerful about them. Maybe it's the craftsmanship, or the way monks whisper over them like they're alive. Fringe theories suggest that some Viking warriors believed Christian relics carried a kind of magic, not divine, but useful. Portable power. Saints as spiritual mercenaries, hired by the highest bidder. You're not entirely convinced, but when you fall ill one winter, feverish, coughing, your limbs heavy with ice, your cousin brings in the village monk, the same one you've mocked for years. He doesn't chant in Latin. He doesn't sprinkle water. He just kneels beside you and prays softly while your breath rasps against the cold. You don't die. You can explain it. Maybe. You're strong. Resilient. Built for snow and hardship. But afterward, when you're up and walking again, your cousin gives you a small silver cross. Just a trinket, he says. You take it. You don't wear it, of course, not openly, but it lives in your belt pouch, wrapped in cloth, next to a carved antler and a piece of sea glass you think might be lucky. It jingles sometimes when you walk. You tell yourself it's just metal, but now, when you raid, you leave the church relics untouched, not out of reverence, out of caution. You don't loot things that stare back at you. Historians still argue whether this early reverence for relics was sincere belief or superstitious pragmatism. You don't know the difference. Belief isn't a switch. It's a slow seep, a quiet fog. One day, you loot a crucifix. A year later, you keep it. A decade later, you kneel in front of it. Not yet. Though, tonight, you sharpen your axe. Again. But your fingers brush that cross in your pouch. You pause. Only a second. Just long enough to wonder what happens to men who kneel instead of fight. You're not ready to find out. Not yet. She arrives with a prayer book and a frown. You've seen women from the South before, foreign merchant wives, slaves taken in raids, an occasional noblewoman escorted with too many guards. But this one, she steps off the boat like she's not afraid of anything. Not your clan, not your gods, not even the fact that the dock is covered in sea slime and smells like someone gutted a seal during high tide. She's your new queen. Well, not yours exactly. She's been married to your king, an ambitious young chieftain who just decided that Viking brides are too shouty and too bloodthirsty. So he picked a Frankish princess instead. Her hair is too smooth. Her shoes are completely impractical. And she doesn't flinch when someone offers her meat in a skull cup. She just says, "I'll pray for you," and moves on. You're not sure if that's a blessing or a curse. Christian queens were one of the key vectors for conversion across Viking territory. It's not always swords and sermons. Sometimes it's a wife who politely refuses to attend your blood sacrifice and insists that the next feast start with grace. Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and even Slavic noblewomen arrived in Norse courts, carrying not just dowries but also faith, relics, and, most annoying of all, priests. This one is no exception. She builds a small chapel behind the longhouse. Not a proper church, just a wooden box with a cross on it and some flowers that keep dying in the frost. She holds prayer meetings, soft singing, Latin mumbling. You walk by with your spear and pretend not to listen. She also insists her children be baptized. This is where it starts getting real. Because the king agrees. Not just because he believes, but because it makes his new in-laws happy. And happy in-laws send ships, traders, and, not incidentally, gold. So he nods, accepts a few psalms, and suddenly, you live in a court where your prince gets dunked in holy water instead of smeared with boar fat. You miss the boar fat. At the next feast, she insists on no blood sacrifices. You're told not to invoke Odin, or Freyr, or even poor Heimdall, who didn't hurt anyone. You're to give thanks instead, quietly, politely, preferably with folded hands and a hymn. You nearly choke on your roast mutton, and yet, you notice something. Things don't fall apart. The crops don't fail. The sea doesn't rise in fury. A storm does hit, but it passes. And when your neighbor's house burns down, the queen sends men to rebuild it and prays for their health while distributing grain. It's irritating. She's making your gods look kind of petty. Historians note that Christian queens often had enormous influence on court culture, not just through religious pressure, but by changing expectations around charity, hospitality, and behavior. Your queen, this quiet, patient missionary in royal silk, starts teaching girls to read. She gives out wool instead of blessings. She teaches people how to bake little cakes in the shape of doves. You try one. It's dry, but you eat it anyway. There's a fringe theory that Norse men married to Christian women, converted less out of belief and more out of sheer attrition. You don't argue. After 6 months, you've stopped offering your morning ale to the gods and started bowing your head when the queen says grace. You don't mean it. Probably. Your king tries to keep balance. One day he sacrifices a horse in secret. The next, he nods politely through a sermon about humility and peace. He's hedging. So are you. Then, one day, a child dies. Not the queen's. Just a village boy. Fever. It happens. But she holds the body, prays over it, and insists on a Christian burial. No ship. No coins for the ferryman. Just soil, a cross, and soft singing. The family sobs. You feel uncomfortable. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's unfamiliar. You used to believe that your dead rode into the sky or sailed to another world. Now they're tucked into the ground with Latin whispers. It feels smaller, but also calmer. You're not sure what that means. Later that night, you see the queen standing alone by the sea. Her veil flutters in the wind. She looks fragile, but her back is straight, and she mutters prayers into the waves like someone talking to an old friend. You don't believe in her God, but you no longer laugh. You never used to think of your king as religious. He was more into spear-throwing contests, long feasts, and occasionally punching a man just to establish a pecking order, but now he's kneeling in front of a monk with a bowl of water, wearing a slightly too small linen robe, and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. You blink. Is this a hostage situation? Nope. This is a baptism. He's getting baptized. You and the other warriors stand at the edge of the wooden chapel, arms crossed, eyebrows raised so high they could catch rain. The monk is mumbling in Latin. The queen watches, her eyes shining like the fjord at sunrise. Someone tries to start a Thor, Thor chant under their breath, but is shushed quickly. This isn't just some polite show for the queen anymore. It's a political move. You don't know what's more shocking, the fact that your king voluntarily got splashed in front of everyone, or the fact that you've started wondering whether this new god, this soft-spoken carpenter with no beard, is actually working. It's not just your kingdom. Across the seas, similar stories unfold. King Ethelbert of Kent, Harold Bluetooth of Denmark, Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, they all, in their own ways, use Christianity as both a diplomatic handshake and a strategic battering ram. Historians widely agree that many Viking rulers converted for political leverage, to secure trade routes, impress Christian monarchs, or simply prevent their territories from being raided by other Christians under the banner of spreading the word. Your king is no fool. After the baptism, he receives gifts from Frankish lords, books, robes, a gold cup shaped like a lily, and enough wine to float a longship. You can't raid a church anymore, but apparently you can own one. That's progress. Still, things are tense. Some of the older jarls grumble in their beards. One even tries to offer a horse to Odin the next morning, but the queen accidentally sends a priest instead. You hear there was a lot of awkward eye contact. No one talks about it again. The younger warriors? They're divided. Some like the idea of not having to burn goats every time they want a good harvest. Others miss the old songs. One tries to combine both. He wears a cross around his neck and carves runes into it. You call it fashion confusion. He calls it spiritual versatility. Your best friend, who used to laugh at monks, now nods respectfully when one passes. You ask him what changed. He shrugs and says, Warcha, they keep fixing my shoulder. To be fair, the monks are good at medicine, and writing, and surviving winters without drinking themselves into a stupor. There's a moment that sticks with you. A missionary, tall, gaunt, and clearly not built for the cold, sits down in your longhouse one evening. Everyone ignores him. Then a child walks over, puts a carved reindeer in his lap, and asks him to bless it. The man does, with a smile. No grand sermon, no threats of damnation, just a soft voice and a funny little sign of the cross. You watch this, pretending not to care. But later, when no one's looking, you touch the toy too, just to see if it feels different. It doesn't. Not really. But still. Historians still argue whether Viking conversions were sincere or just ceremonial. Some kings converted multiple times depending on the audience. Baptized on Tuesday, sacrificing on Thursday, married on Sunday. You suppose it's like having two cloaks, one for war, one for weddings. Fringe researchers even claim some Viking leaders faked conversions to get better trade deals. You respect that. If pretending to like wine and incense gets you 5 ships and a new winter cloak, you can put up with a little Latin, but your king isn't pretending anymore. Not entirely. He orders a wooden cross erected at the harbor, not huge, yet, but visible. He invites more missionaries. The chapel expands. A bell is hung. When it rings, the village dogs howl, and someone makes a joke about Thor rolling over in the sky. Still, the king's grip is tight. You're not forced to convert. But you notice that the warriors who kneel at the chapel tend to get more grain, better weapons, and warmer furs. Coincidence? Sure. Let's call it that. You stand by the chapel one evening, watching the torchlight flicker across the altar. There's a carved Christ there now, thin, sad, but somehow strong. You don't like the look in his eyes. It's like he knows things, like he sees through the layers of blood, bone, and bravado you wear. You turn away before you look too long. Change isn't a lightning strike. It's a slow tide, and tonight the tide has crept just a little higher. You stare at the carved wooden figure again, thin body, arms outstretched, nailed to a cross, no helmet, no sword, no bear cloak, no muscles to speak of. This is your God now? You squint, trying to find the power in him. It's not obvious. He looks wounded, weak. You've spent your whole life admiring gods who throw lightning, ride chariots, shapeshift into wolves, and demand animal sacrifice with a flash of teeth. And now you're being asked to believe in a carpenter who talks about forgiveness and dies on purpose? You can't help it. You laugh, quietly, but still. This Jesus, you mutter to your friend. Why doesn't he just fight back? Your friend shrugs. Maybe he does, just differently. Unhelpful. You toss a pebble at a bird and move on. Still, the image of this strange new god haunts you, because he doesn't look like someone you'd follow into battle, but people do. Your king does. The queen certainly does. The villagers are starting to murmur prayers to him, and even the warriors, the ones who mocked, are now rubbing little crosses before leaving on sea journeys, not because they believe, they say, just in case. The cross isn't replacing Thor's hammer yet, but it's creeping in. There's something unnerving about how quiet Christianity is. No booming thunder, no roaring feasts, just hymns, muttered confessions, and the smell of incense that somehow sticks to your beard. You try to shake it off, but it clings. One night, you sneak into the chapel when no one's around, just to look. The candlelight flickers. You approach the altar. The crucifix stares back. You don't touch it. You just breathe. Slow. Shallow. Like it might jump off the wall if you get too close. You don't believe. You don't want to believe. But something in the room feels heavy. Like the air's pressing in. You leave before anyone sees. Mainstream historians note this period as one of symbolic overlap. Crosses appear beside hammers, prayers beside offerings, saints beside sagas. It wasn't a clean break. It was messy, awkward, and filled with contradictions. One day you sacrifice a chicken. The next, you say a pater noster before raiding a village. The gods seem to tolerate the confusion, or maybe they don't care. One odd thing, Christian gods don't seem jealous. You can't imagine Odin letting his followers dabble. But Jesus, he waits, silently, no thunder, no plague, just that same sad face, nailed to the wood, staring. You ask your queen one night what makes her so sure. She smiles, because he died and came back. You raise an eyebrow. So did my cousin. He got hit with a sheep. She laughs, but not mockingly. Not like this. Apparently, this Jesus not only forgave his killers, but promised them paradise. You don't forgive your enemies. You remember them for generations. But your queen tells you about a God who doesn't demand vengeance, who lets himself be humiliated, tortured, killed, and still chooses love. You tell her that sounds weak. She tells you it's strength you haven't learned to recognize yet. Fringe scholars point out how alien this concept was to Viking ethics. In your world, honor is everything. To be shamed is worse than to die. To let someone strike you without blood repayment, that's madness or cowardice. But this Jesus figure, he flips the whole code on its head. He tells you to love your enemy, turn the other cheek, bless those who curse you. You've never turned a cheek in your life unless it was to swing an axe from the other side. So, you test it. You pick a fight with one of the new converts, gently. A shove, a harsh word. He doesn't hit back, just stares. Says something about patience. You're so surprised you let him walk away. You feel oddly defeated. Not because you lost, but because you weren't sure what the rules were anymore. You walk back to your home that night, restless. The stars overhead are the same ones you've always seen. The sea hisses on the shore, somewhere. An owl hoots. But inside your chest, something is shifting. You touch the pouch at your belt. Inside, next to the carved bone and a flint striker, is the little silver cross. It's grown cold in the night air. You don't believe. You can't believe. But maybe you're not entirely sure anymore. Maybe belief isn't always a bolt of lightning. Maybe, sometimes, it's just a whisper that won't leave. It starts with a lie. You're at a feast. Roasted boar, honeyed mead, some bad flute playing, nothing unusual. Then a merchant from the south walks in, sees the iron hammer at your neck, and wrinkles his nose like you just tracked in mud. You laugh, then pause. Then, almost without thinking, you reach into your pouch and pull out a silver cross. You wear it openly for the first time. Ah, the merchant says, instantly more polite. A Christian? You nod. You are not. But the wine he pours is better, and he offers your village a discount on olive oil. So, who's counting? This is how it begins, not with thunder or divine visions, but with pragmatism. A small nod here, a polite blessing there. You raise your horn and toast to peace instead of to Odin. You don't burn a goat. You light a candle. No one corrects you. This in-between life becomes normal. By day, you wear the hammer. At night, the cross. You still mutter charms when your child is sick, but now you also ask the village priest for a blessing. When the sea is rough, you whisper a prayer to Njord, and a quick plea to the carpenter just in case. Some call it hypocrisy. You call it multitasking. This kind of dual belief isn't rare. Historians call it syncretism, a blending of belief systems, not a replacement. You're not losing your gods. You're just expanding the pantheon, though officially monotheistic. Christianity's saints begin to feel suspiciously like spirits. You invoke Saint Olaf the way your ancestors invoked Tyr, fierce, vengeful, oddly specific in what he helps with. One day, a friend asks you why you bother with the hammer anymore. You shrug. For fishing, you say. He nods solemnly. Fair. You start noticing little changes in the village. The spring festival still happens, but the maypole now has a cross carved at the top. The harvest feast is still loud, but begins with a blessing in Latin and ends with a soft hymn instead of drunken brawling. You still brawl, of course, just more reverently. A new baby is born. You gather for the naming. The mother wants the old ways, runestones, a blood-soaked cloth. The father wants a baptism. They compromise, a Christian name whispered during a pagan ritual. The gods are probably confused. You hope they're also amused. A local craftsman begins carving crosses into his shields, alongside the usual dragons and serpents. You ask him why. He says it's just a design, but the way he says it feels like he's covering something. Fringe scholars point to archaeological finds showing mixed burial styles, graves with both Thor's hammer amulets and small crucifixes, bodies aligned west to east in Christian tradition, but still buried with weapons and grave goods. People like you are hedging your bets. You might end up in Valhalla, or maybe this heaven place. Either way, you're packed for the trip. One night, the priest holds a sermon in your village square. It's cold, his nose drips, the children fidget, but he speaks plainly. You can't serve two masters, he says. You cross your arms. Watch me, you mutter. The queen hears you smiles sadly. The hardest thing to admit isn't that you're changing. It's that you're already changed. You remember your father's funeral, burning boat, shouted sagas, a sword placed in his hand. Now you hear whispers of eternal rest and resurrection. You don't understand the rules of this new afterlife. There are no feasting halls, no Valkyries, no mead rivers, just singing forever. It sounds exhausting. You miss the clarity of the old ways. Fight bravely, die gloriously, be rewarded. Easy. But now you're told that pride is a sin. Revenge is a sin. Excess is a sin. You look around your feast hall and think, we're all going to hell. The priest says no. He says there's forgiveness, a chance to change. You don't trust it, but you keep attending. Historians still argue whether this period represents true religious transformation or merely surface-level compliance. Were Vikings sincere Christians, or just playing along for political convenience? You don't know the answer. Maybe both. All you know is that when the storms come now, you find yourself saying two prayers, one to Thor and one to Christ, and you sleep better afterward. You didn't expect conversion to come with a wardrobe change. One morning, the priest hands you a bundle. It's wool, off-white, and smells faintly of herbs and sheep. For your baptism, he says with a smile. You look down at your blood-stained tunic, the one with the embroidered ravens, and then back at the bundle. You want me to wear this? He nods. It symbolizes purity. You sniff it. It smells like laundry. Still, you take it home, out of curiosity, mostly. And because your queen will definitely ask if you tried it on, you put it on. It's soft. It fits surprisingly well. and it doesn't itch half as much as your ceremonial bear cloak. You look at yourself in a bronze mirror. You don't look like a warrior. You look like someone who sings in Latin and abstains from fun. You sigh, then quietly, you keep it on for just a little while. Baptism has become a thing now. Everyone's doing it. Not because of deep faith necessarily, but because the king said it's strategic. That's his new favorite word. So you line up with half the village beside the river. The priest blesses the water. The queen holds a cross. The children giggle. And you, great hunter of the northern coast, slosh knee-deep into the icy water and pretend you're not freezing your soul off. The priest asks if you renounce the devil. You pause. You've never met the devil. You assume he's like Loki, but less fun. You nod. He dunks you. The cold knocks the air from your lungs. When you come up, everyone claps. You look around as if waiting for a lightning bolt. None arrives. Someone hands you a towel and a loaf of bread shaped like a lamb. You miss mead. Mainstream historians agree that mass baptisms were often less about spiritual rebirth and more about social conformity. Baptism opened trade doors, cemented alliances, and made you part of the civilized world. Plus, if your neighbors got baptized and you didn't, you started looking suspicious. The robe stays on for a while. You get used to it. The priest compliments your humility. You think it just makes your shoulders look broad. Fashion begins to shift around you. Suddenly, bright tunics and embroidered crosses are in. Fur cloaks fall out of favor. Helmets are still popular. But they now have tiny crucifixes etched above the brow line, just in case. You remember when runes covered every surface. Doors, swords, spoons. Now people start carving Latin letters. One man even tattoos Ave Maria on his forearm. You ask what it means. He shrugs. Something about a holy woman in boats. The queen introduces candles. Handmade, beeswax, mildly fragrant. You're told to light one when praying. You accidentally sneeze on the first one and feel vaguely cursed. And then there are the relics. A merchant arrives with a piece of cloth he claims is from the robe of a saint. People gather to see it. Some kneel. One man cries. You lean in, squint, and whisper. It's just wool. The merchant hears you. Smiles. Ah, but it's blessed wool. You nod slowly, the way one nods when pretending to understand a magic trick. Fringe scholars love to argue about relic fraud. Were all those saintly bones and sacred shrouds real? Probably not. But to people like you, they felt real. And feelings you're learning are half the battle. There's a story circulating now about a man who wore a cross into battle and survived 3 spear thrusts. Coincidence? Maybe. But the cross sales surge the next day. Even your sword gets an upgrade. You ask a local smith to etch a small cross near the hilt, not because you believe it makes the blade holier, just luckier. The priest smiles when he sees it. Doesn't scold. Just says, "The Lord works in mysterious steel. You still keep your old things. The hammer of Thor is buried under your cloak, still kissed before long journeys. But now it shares space with a scrap of holy parchment wrapped in deerskin. You whisper to both, just in case. You still drink mead, dance around bonfires, and occasionally yell at the moon, but now you also bow your head before meals and try not to cuss near the chapel. The change isn't instant, but it's happening. One day, you catch your reflection, cross around your neck. Robe draped, just so. And realize you don't look like your father anymore. You look like someone else entirely, someone caught between worlds. And oddly, you're okay with that. You're standing beside a grave and nothing is on fire. That's the first thing you notice. There's no pyre, no boat soaked in oil, no flaming arrows lighting up the fjord, just a patch of fresh earth, a simple wooden cross, and a few wilted flowers. You shift awkwardly. This isn't how you do funerals. You remember your uncle's send-off, how the longship burned like a second sun, how the drums pounded with every heartbeat, how the air reeked of pitch and pine, and grief roared from the throats of the living like a challenge to the gods. Take him. He's earned it. But this? It's quiet. The priest speaks gently in Latin. The queen stands by, her veil fluttering in the wind, tears streaking her face, but no wailing, no keening, just solemn silence. Someone sings a hymn, low and tuneless. You glance around. No one throws weapons into the grave, no coins for the journey, just a folded robe and a carved cross placed on the chest. You swallow. A small part of you feels like something has gone wrong, like this soul isn't going anywhere, and yet, you can't deny the peace of it. The man buried today was the first in your village to be baptized. He lived simply, spoke kindly, died in his sleep. No sword, no glory, no shield raised against death. Just rest. Mainstream historians highlight how funerary practices marked one of the most visible shifts during Christianization. Viking burial customs, cremation, grave goods, ship burials gave way to inhumation, east-west alignment, and spiritual modesty. The fire was replaced by soil, the clamor by prayer. You were skeptical at first, burying someone without weapons? Madness. How would they fight in the afterlife? But the priest says there's no fighting in heaven, no war, no hunger, just light. Sounds suspiciously boring. Fringe scholars point out that even as Christian customs took hold, old habits lingered. Some early Christian graves in Scandinavia still contain knives, whetstones, even charms. You're not surprised. The dead, after all, deserve to be prepared, whatever the destination. After the burial, you walk to the cliffside alone. The wind bites your face, and the sea glitters like spilled treasure. You think of your ancestors. You wonder if they're watching, judging, scoffing, and then you remember your cousin's burial, years ago, a young warrior. Boat set ablaze, cheers of Valhalla echoing into the dusk. But then the boat caught a strange current, turned back toward shore, and beached itself half-burned. The village laughed, called it a sign. You weren't so sure. Maybe fire isn't always a clear path. You run your fingers through the cold grass. Somewhere deep down, you start to consider what it would mean to be buried like this yourself. No ship, no sword, just rest. No proving, no war cries, just peace. You shake the thought off like snow. Not yet. Still, the burial stays with you, more than you want to admit. That night, you sit by your hearth. Your daughter plays with carved dolls. One is a Valkyrie, the other a saint in a robe. You ask which one wins their imaginary fight. She shrugs. They're friends. You blink. Since when? Since the saint gave her cake. You stare into the fire and try not to feel outnumbered. Later, you speak with the priest. Ask him what happens to those who weren't baptized. The old warriors. Your father. He doesn't give a clear answer. Just says that mercy is vast. You nod. That's vague enough to feel comforting. Historians still debate how Viking communities reconciled old beliefs about the afterlife, Valhalla, hell, the eternal mead halls, with Christian notions of heaven and hell. The truth is, they didn't, they just layered them. You still talk about the Valkyries sometimes, but now you also say, may he rest in peace. Tonight, the stars seem softer, the sea quieter, and the grave, that simple mound of earth, doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a pause. You're sitting in the longhouse, carving a fishing hook from bone, when the priest pulls up a stool beside you and says, "Let's talk about guilt." You glance at him. Why? Because, he says with a smile, you're very bad at it. You snort. We don't do guilt. We do shame. Exactly, he replies, as if that explains everything. In your world, if you mess up, you atone, publicly, with blood, or coin, or at least a really dramatic apology involving feasting the offended party until they forget what you did. Guilt? That's private, that's internal, that's suspiciously sneaky. But the priest insists. He tells you guilt isn't about what people saw you do, it's about what you know you did. Even if no one else knows, even if you weren't caught, you stare at him like he just described a sword that only stabs the inside of your chest. You're used to law codes that list offenses in neat little rows. Steal a goat, pay 3 silver, insult a jarl, lose a finger. Everything has a weight, a cost, a clean resolution, but now you're told that intent matters, that even thinking about stealing the goat is wrong. Even if you don't actually do it, you sigh. So, just sitting here thinking about punching my cousin counts as sin. Yes. What if he deserves it? That's between you and God. You mutter something about how even Odin would approve of punching your cousin. Christianity introduces a very different moral framework. Sin becomes not just a social offense, but a spiritual stain. You're told it builds up, like soot in the soul. You need confession, repentance, forgiveness, not from the village, from the divine. It's a lot. You hear new words, penance, grace, temptation. You try using one in a sentence. I was tempted to eat your bread, but I showed restraint. The priest beams. Almost. You steal the bread anyway. Old habits die hard. Historians agree that Christian concepts of guilt, sin, and confession were radically different from Norse moral systems. Viking justice was external, transactional, and honor-bound. Christianity internalized morality. It whispered that even your dreams might be dangerous. You begin to feel watched, not by the king or the village, but by something bigger, something quiet, something that doesn't wait for you to be caught. It just knows. And then there's the problem of desire. You hear stories of saints who fasted for weeks, walked barefoot through snow, gave away all their possessions, and resisted every form of pleasure, including the fun kind. You ask the priest if that's required. He says no, then tells you about Saint Cuthbert, who lived with otters and refused to speak for a year. You hope that's not a standard practice. One morning, you go to the chapel and find the priest with his forehead pressed to the floor, whispering. You ask if he's sick. He says he's repenting. For what? You ask. For being proud of not being proud? He says. You leave before your brain unravels. The queen now speaks often of virtue. She encourages the women to be humble, the men to be gentle, and everyone to stop yelling at dinner. You remember when mealtime was a competitive eating contest. Now it starts with a prayer and ends with quiet reflection. You hate it. But you also sleep better. A few warriors start meeting privately with the priest, confessing, whispering. You mock them, lightly, but part of you wonders, what does it feel like to be forgiven? Not by the village, not by your family, by God? You try it once. The priest listens, nods, asks questions you don't like, then says something about mercy that makes your throat feel tight. You leave before he sees your eyes. Fringe scholars argue about how confession was introduced in Norse societies. Some think it was a tool of control, an emotional surveillance system. Others say it provided emotional relief in a culture where feelings were usually buried under axes and beer. You don't care what they say. All you know is that you haven't punched your cousin in weeks. You think about sin differently now, not just what you do, but what you carry. And some days, the burden feels lighter after a conversation in a cold wooden room with someone who says, "You are still loved." You're not sure you believe it, but it's something. You're sitting outside the chapel one morning, gnawing on a crust of bread that could double as a roof tile, when you overhear the priest telling a story to the children. It's about a saint who refused to marry because she wanted to stay pure and belong only to Christ. You almost choke on your bread. You elbow your friend. Is he saying she didn't want to get married? He nods. Apparently, it's a virtue now. You stare at the priest like he's grown horns. Voluntary celibacy? In your world, marriage is essential, not optional. You marry to expand your clan, secure alliances, and, let's be honest, avoid having to cook your own food. To refuse marriage? That's not virtue. That's lunacy. But Christian stories are filled with these baffling characters. Virgins who become martyrs, men who resist temptation, women who spend decades praying instead of, well, living. You begin to realize this new religion has a completely different definition of heroism. You used to admire shield maidens, fierce, sharp-tongued, drenched in glory. Now people are naming their daughters after pale saints who spoke in whispers and took vows of silence. You don't even know how to pronounce half the names. Your cousin stops carving Valkyries into her spindle whorls, starts drawing angels instead. You ask her what happened. They're nicer, she says, and they don't stab people. You mutter that they sound boring. She shrugs. That's sort of the point. Mainstream historians mark this shift in feminine ideals as a major cultural pivot. Viking women were once admired for resilience, cunning, even combat prowess. Christianity introduces a quieter model: piety, modesty, obedience, saints instead of sword maidens. The fire dims. You're not the only one who notices. At feasts, you hear older women complaining. In my day, we brewed mead, birthed 6 children, and hexed our husbands if they wandered. Now their daughters are chanting psalms and refusing second helpings of stew. A fringe theory suggests this change was part of a larger strategy to control female agency by sanctifying submission and labeling desire as sin. You're not sure about that, but you are sure that marriages are getting more complicated. Used to be. You saw someone, like their cow collection, and made an offer. Now you need a blessing, a sacrament, a vow before God. Suddenly, marriage isn't just a deal, it's holy. That's a lot of pressure for a man who just wants to settle down and eat in peace. And then there's the matter of saints. They're everywhere now. Tiny icons painted onto wood, names invoked at births and funerals. One woman swears that Saint Bridget helped her find her lost comb. You're pretty sure it was in her pocket the whole time. Your favorite story is about Saint Margaret, who was swallowed by a dragon and burst out unharmed because of her purity. You ask how that works. The priest says, "It's symbolic. You prefer your myths with fewer metaphors and more axes. But your niece now owns a doll called Saint Agnes. She makes you play tea party with it. You try to introduce a Viking berserker into the story, but she frowns and says, 'Agnes doesn't fight. She forgives.' You sigh and pass the imaginary tea. You think about the old days, when women read runes, led rituals, brewed charms, when they chose their husbands, or didn't, and no one called it sinful. Your grandmother once hexed an entire fishing boat for mocking her stew. Now she lights candles and murmurs psalms. You ask her why she changed. She says, 'I like the quiet.' Maybe that's the real shift. Christianity hasn't just changed your gods. It's changed your heroes. It's not that you've forgotten Freya or the Valkyries. It's that their stories don't get told as loudly anymore. And when they do, they're sometimes followed by a gentle voice saying, 'But now, let us hear of Saint Lucia. You don't believe it yet, not all the way, but when your daughter says she wants to be a healer, not a shield maiden, you don't argue. You just ask if she'll still visit you when you're old.' She smiles. Every Sunday, after Mass, you groan. She grins. You suppose there are worse fates than being nagged into salvation. You wake up to find your best sheep gone. At first, you blame wolves. Then you blame your neighbor. Then, reluctantly, you blame your nephew who's been eyeing your flock with the subtlety of a bear in a berry patch. But before you can storm over and accuse anyone with your usual dramatic flair, the priest shows up at your door. He's holding a basket of bread and a piece of parchment. 'You've been avoiding tithe collection,' he says. You stare. 'You think I paid in sheep?' He smiles gently. 'No. But the Lord works in mysterious debits. Welcome to the world of Christian taxes. In the old days, you paid tribute to the Jarl. A clean system. Give silver, get protection, don't pay, get stabbed. But now, there's a second stream of obligation. Tithes. 10% of your grain, or fish, or wool, or apparently sheep. At first, you laugh. What does God need with rye? Turns out, he needs a lot. Churches cost silver. Monks need to eat. Candles don't grow on trees. And your queen insists that charity is a virtue, especially when it comes out of your pantry. You grumble, but you pay. Because when you don't, the priest still smiles, but writes your name on a suspicious little scroll. You're told it's just for records. You feel like it's a divine hit list. Mainstream historians note that as Christianity spread, so did its financial infrastructure. Monasteries became economic powerhouses, collecting donations, managing farmland, and, in some cases, owning more cows than kings. You thought this faith was about turning the other cheek, not charging rent on it. You visit the chapel one day and see your neighbor lighting a candle. You ask what it cost. He whispers, 3 eggs. You scoff. I lit a whole bonfire last winter for free. Did it bring your wife back? You shut up. Christian giving is framed as spiritual discipline. But let's be honest, it's also economics. A small tax. in exchange for cosmic insurance. Pay now, sin less later. You hear people joke that salvation comes with a monthly subscription, but it's not all loss, because the church gives too. Your niece gets sick, the priest visits daily, brings herbs, stays up reading prayers while you pretend not to watch. She gets better. At the next tithe, you pay with extra flour. You don't say why. Then there's the wine. You attend Mass one morning, just to see what the fuss is about. The bread is bland, but the wine is shockingly good. You go back the next week way accidentally early and help the priest unpack a new barrel. Helping becomes a routine. The priest never asks why. You like that. Feasts change too. They're quieter, yes, but longer. With fewer fistfights and more toasts, people drink less, or they pretend to. You miss the chaos, but you don't miss cleaning blood off your boots. You notice that Christian festivals tend to involve bread, candles, and a whole lot of waiting. Advent feels like a month-long pause. Lent makes people grumpy and thin. Easter involves confusing metaphors and suspiciously joyful singing. Still, it's growing on you. There's a new sense of rhythm. Fast, feast, give, reflect. It makes the seasons feel less random. You plant crops, pay tithes, confess sins, and try not to swear too loudly in front of the altar boy. You hear rumors of a nearby monastery accepting land donations. One elder gives up a whole field for the sake of his soul. You suspect it has more to do with his children being awful, but the priest blesses him anyway. Fringe scholars debate whether this donation culture was piety or pressure. You think it was probably both. But you can't deny that the church feeds the poor, shelters travelers, and gives decent advice when you're too proud to ask your wife. You try fasting once. It's awful. You spend the whole day fantasizing about cheese. But oddly enough, when you finally break fast, the food tastes better. You feel weirdly grateful. You don't like it. Your daughter suggests you fast every week. You ground her. Still, you start keeping a little ledger in your head. What you've given, what you've received. Not just goods, but peace, safety, a new sense of community, a strange comfort in knowing you're not the only one bumbling toward virtue. One night, you find your remaining sheep standing near the chapel. You could accuse someone, or demand a fine. Instead, you thank God, drag it home, and whisper, "You owe me 10% of your grass." It blinks. You consider that progress. You're staring at a runestone, and it's staring back, or at least, it feels that way. You've passed this stone 100 times, carved long ago by someone's uncle, commemorating some cousin, probably involving a very impressive axe. But now there's something new on it in the, cross. Not carved hastily, not hidden, not an afterthought. Right at the top, above the winding serpents and twisty runes, is a plain Latin cross. Bold, confident, a declaration. You touch it. The stone is cold. So is the realization. Even the dead are converting. Runestones are your people's way of talking to time. The old ones tell stories of deeds, journeys, kinship, vengeance. They say, I was here, I mattered. Now they're starting to say, I believed in Christ. Mainstream historians call this the Christianization of memory. Even the way you record your lives, your legacies, is changing. There are still dragons, yes, but they coil around crosses now. Runes still speak, but they speak of faith, not just feats. You visit your father's stone. It has no cross. You wonder if that matters. You're told it doesn't, that God sees the heart, not the rock. But still, you run your fingers over the old symbols. You wonder if your children will carve yours with a cross, or with both, or neither. One afternoon, a new carver arrives from the south. He doesn't do serpents. He does saints. Tiny, round-eyed, oddly stiff-looking saints, etched into wood and painted in colors you didn't know existed, blues like glacier ice, reds like ash trees in fall. You ask if he'll carve you a shield design. He offers a haloed saint holding a fish. You say you were thinking more of a wolf. He says, Saint Francis liked animals. You compromise, saint on one side, wolf on the other. You call it balanced spiritual aggression. Fringe scholars debate whether this artistic shift was natural evolution or cultural erasure. You don't know. All you know is that your cousin, who used to draw longboats with teeth, now paints scrolls of angels, and you kinda like them. Even if the wings look impractical, you start seeing crosses everywhere, on swords, on belt buckles, scratched into door lintels, painted above cradles. It used to be Thor's hammer that marked protection. Now it's a cross drawn in chalk by a mumbling priest who smells like garlic and good intentions. You don't entirely trust it, but when your barn catches fire one stormy night, and the only thing left untouched is a cross-shaped beam, you raise an eyebrow. The priest says it's a sign. You say it's coincidence. Still, you don't rebuild without carving one just like it. Children now learn Latin prayers before they learn how to hold a blade. They chant Pater Noster while herding goats. One kid says he saw Jesus in the clouds. You squint and see a bird. He insists it was a dove. You shrug. Same family. At the winter feast, the skald stands up to recite a saga. Everyone quiets. He begins with Odin, Thor, and the world tree, but halfway through, he slips in a saint, just a little one, a monk who walked across the sea on a floating cloak. You blink. No one protests. The old stories aren't being replaced. They're being edited, merged, softened. You try telling your favorite saga about the hero who kills a troll with a fish. The priest laughs and says it reminds him of Saint Peter. You're mildly offended. Art becomes a battleground. You see paintings of Christ that are oddly familiar, stronger jawlines, longer hair, more dramatic skies. He looks suspiciously like a Viking. You point this out. The priest winks. Inculturation, he says. You call it smart marketing. You miss the old carvings sometimes. The wild, snarling beasts. The shameless flair. But there's something beautiful about the new art, too. The colors, the calmness, the stillness in the faces. One day, you carve a small cross into the base of your fishing spear. No one sees, but you know it's there, just in case. You slam your drinking horn down on the table and look around, confused. Where's the mead? The priest, seated 3 places down, offers you a gentle smile and a cup of something warm and beige. It's barley water, he says. You stare at it like it just insulted your mother. The feast is quieter than usual. No wrestling, no boasts of conquest, no one dancing on the table in a bear pelt. The food is still good, roast lamb, thick stews, warm bread, but the air lacks that familiar buzz. There's a new rule. No blood offerings, no obscene toasts, no invoking Loki during dessert. You bite into a carrot and weep inwardly. Christianity has arrived at the dinner table. It's subtle at first. A new grace before meals. Fewer drinking contests. More humble sharing. You used to measure a feast by how many people passed out under the table. Now, you measure it by how many psalms were sung before soup. You miss the chaos. Mainstream historians often note that Christianization didn't just change public rituals, it reshaped daily life. Meals became moments of reflection, not just consumption. Fasting seasons like Lent disrupted your usual rhythm of gluttony and feasting. You're told that denying the flesh strengthens the soul. You ask if beer counts as flesh. The priest says yes. You mutter something unrepeatable. The alehouse down the road is quieter now. No more late-night brawls, fewer broken chairs, and significantly more discussions about grace. Someone writes a hymn on the back of a mead barrel. You take a drink and pretend not to hum it. At the next village feast, the queen replaces the offering of boar's blood with a ceremonial lighting of candles. Children walk in procession, holding tiny flames and singing about joy. It's adorable, also terrifying. At least 3 of them are clearly future saints. You wonder if there's a patron of spilled gravy. You tell a dirty joke halfway through dinner and get 3 gasps and a disappointed sigh from the priest. You decide to save your Valkyrie and the goat routine for after dessert. Fringe scholars suggest that changes in mealtime behavior reflect deeper shifts in how people saw themselves, not just as warriors or farmers, but as souls. Meals became sacred, not just social, a place for gratitude, not just gluttony. You still miss the mead, but then again, you haven't woken up in a ditch with a turnip in your mouth in a while. There are upsides. The food has changed. 2, fewer raw onions, more bread, more stews that don't make your stomach rebel. And the priest's wife, yes, priests can marry here, strangely, makes a honey cake that might actually convert you. You start noticing how people eat. Slower, with a kind of reverence. There's less shouting, more conversation, less proving, more pausing. One evening, your daughter offers the evening prayer. She thanks God for the bread, the soup, the goats, and Father's weird nose. You glare. Everyone laughs. You do too. That night, you feel full, not just in your belly, in your chest. You remember the old feasts. Yes, the fires, the shouting, the bone drums, the stories that got better with every drink. But now, there's a different kind of memory forming, a quiet one. The sound of your son reciting a psalm with gravy on his chin, the flicker of candlelight on your wife's face as she hums a hymn under her breath. You used to think joy had to be loud. Maybe not. Maybe it just needs to last longer. You still sneak a flask of mead into the feast sometimes. You share it with the priest. He sips, coughs, and whispers. Don't tell the bishop. You don't even know what a bishop is. But you raise your cups anyway. To peace. To pudding. To the strange, steady warmth of a meal where everyone leaves upright. Not bad. Not bad at all. You hear the sound of hammers before you see it. Not blacksmiths this time. Builders. Wood creaks. Saws buzz. And someone's yelling about a crooked beam. You walk toward the center of the village, expecting another longhouse going up. Maybe someone's getting married. Or maybe your cousin set his roof on fire again. But no. This is something different. Your Jarl is building a chapel, not a shed, not a shrine tucked in a sheep pen. A real chapel, with a pointed roof, narrow windows, a bell tower, and a door that doesn't squeak when you open it. The cross on top is so tall it could jab the moon. You squint. Did he lose a bet? No. Someone whispers. He says it's strategic. There it is again. That word. Strategic. Your Jarl used to build shipyards, forts, training fields. Now he's funding priests, buying candles in bulk, and hiring stonemasons who talk about acoustics and light angles. He even moved the sacrifice stone. You find it behind the bakery, leaning against a wall like a disgraced family member no one wants to throw out, but no one wants to invite to dinner either. Mainstream historians note that as more Norse elites converted, they didn't just accept Christianity, they sponsored it. Building churches became a power move. It showed piety and wealth. It made you look civilized to foreign allies and intimidating to local rivals. But for villagers like you, it's confusing, because with every beam raised, a little bit of the old world disappears. The sacred grove, now fenced off. The old well where women used to leave offerings, covered and reclaimed for hygiene. The rock where you carved runes with your friends as kids. Painted over with something called Psalm 23. You try to stay neutral, but it's hard when your past keeps getting remodeled. Still, the chapel is beautiful. You walk through it once, just to see the windows glow like trapped sunlight. The air smells like wood polish and hope. You sit on a bench, just for a minute. No one kicks you out. You find yourself coming back, quietly, not for sermons, just to sit, sometimes with a question, sometimes with nothing but tiredness. The Jarl's not always in there, but when he is, he doesn't say much either, just nods. And one day, he surprises you. He tells you he still keeps his father's hammer under the floorboards. Not for worship, he says. Just for memory. You nod. That feels honest. A fringe theory claims that Norse leaders used the church as a new kind of ritual space, replacing the hall but keeping the authority. The priest became a kind of social anchor, like a law speaker, but with incense. You see that happening. People now go to the chapel with news, to cry, to think, to get married, to argue about who should fix the bridge. The building's not just for worship, it's for life. But it's a strange life, one where children learn their letters in Latin, where weddings come with vows before God instead of blood pacts before the gods, where forgiveness replaces feud, and someone says, "Let us pray," instead of "let us fight." You find a rune tucked under a chapel bench one day, just a small one, a message scratched in with a knife. You can barely read it. "I miss Thor." You smile. You leave it there. One day, you help the priest fix the door latch, not because you believe, but because it squeaks. You can't not fix it. He thanks you, offers wine. You drink it slowly and ask about the crossbeams. You pretend not to care about the answer. Later that night, you walk past the chapel again. A candle glows in the window. Someone's praying inside. You don't go in, but you stop walking. For a moment. Just a moment. And listen. She no longer mutters over bones. That's how you know it's serious. Your grandmother, who once whispered spells over nettles, tied knots to curse unfaithful men, and claimed to see omens in goat entrails, now spends her mornings dipping wicks into beeswax and humming psalms off-key. You stand in the doorway, arms crossed. What happened to the rune sticks? She doesn't look up. They're for stories now. Stories. She nods. Fairy tales. For the little ones. You glance at the dusty bundle tucked in the corner, the once sacred runes, bundled in linen, forgotten like an old sword no one sharpens anymore. You sigh. The age of magic is fading, and in its place, candles, prayers, psalms. Christianity hasn't just crept into your halls or your feasts, it's crept into your hearth, into the way women speak to each other, into the rhythms of domestic life. Mainstream historians point out that women were often key carriers of folk tradition, herbal knowledge, and spiritual rituals. In Norse society, women weren't passive. They brewed charms, kept the calendar, led fertility rites, and read omens in smoke and ash. Now, they're being handed rosaries. You see the shift everywhere. Your aunt, who used to chant protection spells over her pickled herring jars, now simply crosses herself and says, God willing, it'll keep. Your cousin no longer wears the amulet your grandfather made her. She wears a crucifix instead, delicate, gold, probably imported from Francia. You joke that the old gods must be bored. No one's sacrificing pigs anymore. Your sister glares and tells you to keep your voice down around the children. Why, you ask? Because they don't need to be afraid? That one stings. Because maybe, deep down, you were afraid of curses, of spirits, of frost giants that might snatch your soul while you sleep, but fear kept you careful. Now you're told to trust, to have faith. That's not your instinct. And yet, there's peace in the new rhythm. Women gather not to chant, but to sing, softly, in harmony. Instead of mixing herbs in secret, they now bake loaves for the poor. The hush of magic has become the hum of charity. Still, a few hold on. One night, you catch your grandmother slipping something into the stew. You ask her what it was. Just a little sage, she says. You raise an eyebrow. Blessed sage? She winks. Old habits die like stubborn weeds. Fringe scholars argue whether Christianization silenced or simply absorbed old, feminine practices. Some say the church empowered women in new roles, as midwives, caretakers, healers. Others say it stripped them of their agency, rebranding their knowledge as superstition. You think both are true, because your grandmother hasn't forgotten everything. She still leaves bread at the crossroads on the last frost of spring. She still hums a protection tune when someone gives birth. But now she also lights a candle at the chapel and prays to Mary. Just in case. Your little niece no longer learns charms. She learns Bible stories. But one day, you see her draw a Valkyrie in the dirt, wings spread, sword raised. Who's that? You ask. She guards me, she says, matter of fact. You smile. She doesn't know that blend of belief used to be heresy. Now it's just natural. At the next wedding, the women still braid the bride's hair with flowers. They still tell jokes, still dance, still hum the same old melody, just slightly softer now. No one calls on Freya, but no one quite forgets her, either. You ask your grandmother if she regrets the change. She lights a candle. Some days, she says, but not when it's raining. Why? Because it's warmer inside now. You don't ask what she means, but you think you understand. You're at a wedding feast, halfway through your second bowl of stew, when someone announces the happy couple is not related. A cheer goes up. You raise your cup, then pause. Wait a minute. Not related? You lean over to your cousin. Since when is that special? He shrugs. Since the priest started keeping records. Ah, so that's what's going on. Marriage used to be simpler. You married for land, for cows, for peace between feuding families. If your bride happened to be your second cousin, twice removed, so be it. Who had the time to check? But now, the priest is involved, with a book, and he's writing things down. Names, birth dates, parents, which means for the first time ever. You have to think about kinship lines when falling in love. You didn't sign up for genealogy. Christianity brings a new set of rules to the table, and they aren't all about candles and fasting. They're about who you can and can't marry. Suddenly, sleeping with your cousin isn't just awkward at reunions, it's sinful. Mainstream historians highlight how Christian marriage laws transformed Viking kinship systems. The church introduced stricter prohibitions against incest and expanded the definition of who was too close to marry. Where you used to count kin by who shared blood in the last 2 generations, the church counts back to the 7th. That's a lot of family to keep track of. You overhear a scandal at the next feast. Someone's betrothal canceled because the bride's great-great-grandmother's brother once milked the same goat as the groom's uncle, or something like that. You can't keep it straight. And then there's consent. Not yours. Hers. Christian marriage requires the bride to agree, out loud, with witnesses. You remember when your uncle agreed to his wife's marriage on her behalf, while she was out feeding chickens. Now, she gets a seat at the negotiation table. Sometimes 2. Sometimes she brings her priest. You're told a woman has the right to say no. You're still getting used to that. It's not that women didn't have power before. They did. But now it's codified. Christian law gives wives certain protections. No more beating them for burning stew. No more tossing them out if they can't bear sons. You've seen a man fined for insulting his wife in public. That used to be the opening act at feasts. Fringe scholars debate whether this new marital structure empowered women or simply trapped them in new forms of obedience. You've heard both arguments. All you know is your sister just called off an engagement because the groom didn't respect her prayers. You're proud and slightly terrified. Marriage ceremonies themselves have changed. They're now held inside the chapel. No axes, no blood, no ceremonial tying of cloaks, just vows, rings, prayers, kisses that last slightly too long for your taste, and at least 3 Latin words no one understands. Your own wedding was a blur. You remember the priest asking you to renounce the devil. You said yes. You were mostly thinking of your cousin Harold. Then came the vow of faithfulness. You said yes again. You avoided eye contact with your ex from 2 tables over. The feast was still fun. But you couldn't help noticing there was less singing and more sitting, more speeches about the sanctity of union, and fewer drinking games involving eels. Still, your wife looked radiant, and you got through the whole day without a single brawl. Progress? You start seeing little differences in how people love. More hand-holding, more kindness, fewer alliances forged with fear, and more based on affection. It feels strange, but good. You catch 2 young people sneaking away behind the chapel one evening. You prepare your best joke, but before you say anything, they stop and pray together. You walk away, deeply confused. Your daughter asks what love is. You start to tell her it's about cows and land and which family will bring the most warriors to your aid, but she interrupts and says, "No, like in the chapel stories." You freeze. You don't have an answer, but maybe You don't need one yet. Because for the first time in a long time, people seem to be marrying with more than strategy in mind. They marry with hope. Your grandson is sitting beside you, reading the Psalms, out loud, slowly, carefully, like the words themselves are made of glass. His little brow furrows at every second syllable. You nod along, pretending to understand every verse. You don't. But you're proud anyway. He wears velvet robes now, not furs. He quotes Jesus more than Thor. And when he prays, he closes his eyes like he's talking to someone he's actually met. You don't recognize him. And somehow, you recognize him more than anyone. You remember when your sons played war in the mud, pretending to be berserkers, biting their shields and charging chickens. Now your grandson wears sandals and sings hymns about peace. He recites lessons from a monk named Augustine and tells you that anger is a form of weakness. You try not to laugh in his face. You don't want to discourage him. But part of you mourns the missing fire. Where's the rage? The hunt? The blood feast joy of returning home with salt spray in your beard and someone else's sword as a trophy? Mainstream historians observe this generational divide with fascination. Within just a few decades, Viking culture shifted from celebrating sea kings to nurturing saintly kings, from warlords to monarchs who commissioned churches, issued Christian laws, and prayed before battle, if they fought at all. Power became less about fear and more about divine right. Less iron fist, more open palm. You watch your grandson kiss the hand of a bishop. You try not to growl. He doesn't want to raid. He wants to go on pilgrimage. To Rome, no less. You joke that he won't make it past Denmark without getting mugged. He calmly replies that God will protect him. You eye his traveling bag. There's no axe in it. Just bread, a cross, and a book you can't read. At first, you think he's soft. But then you watch him during a dispute between farmers. He listens to both sides. He quotes scripture. He mediates. No shouting, no blood, just a solution. You mutter. He would have made a terrible jarl. Your daughter hears you. Maybe, she says, but he's a great man. You grumble, but don't argue. Fringe scholars love to dig into this identity shift, how the once feared Viking image gave way to rulers who modeled themselves after Christ instead of Odin. Some call it a loss of soul, others call it civilization. You're somewhere in between, because you still dream of battles, of the clang of iron, of the smell of the sea when your ship crests the wave like a beast. But now, when you wake, you hear birdsong, and your grandson, already up, already praying. You sit beside him once, just to see what it feels like. He doesn't make a show of it, doesn't ask you to join in. He just smiles, scoots over, and keeps whispering. You don't close your eyes. Not yet. But you stay. He's not weak. He's different. When the Jarl dies, your grandson doesn't claim the throne through force. He's chosen by council. They respect him, not for what he can break, but for what he can heal. He speaks softly, but when he does, people listen. You find yourself listening. 2. One evening, he asks about your past. You tell him the truth, about raids, about gods, about the things you saw and did, and the fire that once burned in your bones. He doesn't flinch. He just nods. And now? You think for a long time? I still feel the fire, you say, but I don't need it like I used to. He places a hand on yours. That's wisdom. You roll your eyes. That's age. He laughs. You look at him, not as a stranger, not as a disappointment, but as what he truly is. The next chapter. Different ink. Same story. You sit by the hearth, carving a little wooden figure, a hero, sword raised, cloak billowing, the kind of warrior who once leapt from saga to saga, always swinging, never doubting. You used to tell these stories loud and long, punctuated with slaps on the table and tankards raised high. Now, your grandson tells stories about saints. You tried to listen the other night. He told one about a man who was tortured for his faith, forgave his enemies, and died singing. Everyone nodded solemnly. You wanted to ask, where's the part where he cleaves his way through the afterlife to feast with the gods? But you didn't. You just kept whittling. Because somewhere along the way, the stories changed. The skalds used to chant of Odin dangling from the world tree, of Thor smashing giants, of Freya choosing the dead. Now, in the square, the children reenact Noah and his animals, David and Goliath, Jonah and the fish. Still epic, but tamer. Your niece once asked you what Valhalla was. You paused. She'd only heard of heaven. You told her Valhalla was where warriors go when they die in glory. She said, but what if they just want to rest? You had no answer. Mainstream historians document this narrative transformation in detail. As Christianity spread, oral sagas were gradually replaced or softened by written scripture. The great halls of dead heroes were outshone by eternal paradise. The battlefield became less of a destiny, more of a cautionary tale. The bards adapt. Some still sing the old stories, but they blend them now. Odin becomes symbolic. Thor becomes allegorical. Loki becomes suspiciously similar to the devil. Even Ragnarok is reinterpreted, not as doom, but as warning. At the next village gathering, a young bard sings a tale of a warrior who lays down his sword to follow Christ. You raise an eyebrow. Some of the elders grumble, but the crowd listens, rapt, touched. You remember when a saga ended with a roar. Now it ends with silence, a prayer, a soft exhale. Fringe theories suggest that some Viking tales were intentionally rewritten to align with Christian morality. Heroes who once claimed vengeance now show mercy. Witches vanish. Sorcerers become saints. You once fought for honor. Now, you're told honor lies in forgiveness. You don't hate it, but part of you misses the chaos. Still, you adapt. Your daughter asks you to tell a bedtime story. You think of Beowulf, then realize he's now preached in church as a Christian allegory. You chuckle. You tell her about a man who fought monsters. Yes, but also about how he chose not to fight one, because he saw it was just afraid. She falls asleep smiling. You stare into the fire. In the old stories, flames were cleansing, destructive, sacred. Now they're just warm. You whisper an old saga under your breath. Just the start of it. Just enough to feel the rhythm. Then you say a little prayer. Not loudly. Just to the dark. And that night, you dream of both. Of Valhalla and heaven. Of warriors and saints, of two great halls, side by side, and in your dream, they don't argue. They share a meal. The wind howls outside, but you're warm. That used to mean a fire pit and a bearskin, and someone snoring beside you after a feast. Now it means stone walls, a tiled roof, and a chapel bell that rings every evening whether you like it or not. You never thought you'd grow old in a church. not living in it, of course, but right beside it, the new longhouse is smaller, quieter, and built with Christian modesty in mind, though your wife still insists on painting a dragon over the hearth. For tradition. You lie on a wooden bed, no furs, no torchlight, just candle glow and the creak of timber beams. The priest stops by now and then to check your breathing. You tell him you're still alive, mostly out of spite. He laughs. You like him. You remember your father's death, on a flaming boat, sword in hand, with half the village screaming into the night, a proper send-off, smoke curling into the stars, the smell of salt, ash, and pride. That won't be your story. Your grave is already dug, just outside the chapel wall. Simple, no gold, no bones of past champions, no ship, just you, some earth, and a cross carved with your name, misspelled, but charmingly so. You thought you'd fear this moment. You don't. You miss the old gods sometimes. Miss the theater of it all, the blood rites, the songs, the fierce beauty of believing in a world that demanded your courage at every turn. But the gods have gone quiet. Or maybe, just maybe, they've left you in peace. Mainstream historians often describe the final stage of Christianization as one of personal surrender. It didn't always mean full belief. Sometimes it just meant acceptance. A decision to lie down in a new world and let the sky go on turning. That's where you are now. You close your eyes and hear the chapel bell. Someone singing a hymn, off key. You suspect it's your grandson. You forgive him. A priest enters and offers you the last rites. You nod. He anoints your brow. It's warm. He says words you only half understand, but they settle into your chest like soft stones. You think of your life, the oars and the axes, the feasts and the fights, the fire and the frost. You think of your first prayer, clumsy and whispered into the dark. You think of your last story, told just last night, where a saint rides a wolf into battle and forgives his enemies at the end. You think of rest, not the kind earned by steel, the kind given. Your fingers twitch once, then still. The priest folds your hands. Your family weeps. The wind keeps howling, but the stone walls hold strong. They bury you the next day. No longship, no horns, just a hymn, a pause, a soft exhale. And when the candle burns low in the chapel that night, someone says your name during prayers, not as a hero, as someone loved. Now the fire's down to embers, and the room grows quiet. The chapel bell has long since stopped ringing. The village is asleep. The sea is still. And somewhere, beneath stone and earth and sky, your bones rest with the stories of both gods and God wrapped around them like a woolen shroud. It didn't happen all at once. This change. Faith is never a sword stroke. It's a slow drift, a tide reshaping the shore. Over years, decades, lifetimes. But you felt it, in the shifting stories, in the softened feasts, in the strange new kindness that crept in beside the discipline. The gods you once followed were fierce and beautiful and terrifying, and maybe they still are, in some far-off part of the sky. But now, there is peace, not from conquest, but from release. You don't carry the axe anymore. You don't need to. That chapter has ended. What you carry instead is memory, and mercy, and maybe even grace. So let your breath slow, let the candle flicker, Let your thoughts be distant ships, fading into the mist. You've walked a long road, from longhouse to chapel, from fury to faith, from fire to light, and now, at last, you are still. Good night, old soul. Sleep well. You're home. End of script. Sweet dreams.